Hello, my name is Vince Greenwood. I am the director of the Washington Center for Cognitive Therapy, a mental health organization that specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders. In this video, I am going to talk about generalized anxiety disorder, also referred to as GAD. Generalized anxiety disorder is a diagnosable condition characterized by excessive worry and a cluster of physical symptoms such as muscle tension, restlessness, fatigue, irritability, and sleep difficulties. Over the past few decades, we have learned a good deal about generalized anxiety disorder and its treatment. I am going to describe the components of generalized anxiety disorder, the particular thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that make up GAD, so that you have a clearer, more detailed understanding of GAD, and show how that understanding has been utilized by cognitive behavioral practitioners to develop a highly effective, research-supported treatment for generalized anxiety disorder. I am also going to provide some guidelines on how you can distinguish between a tendency to worry and full-blown GAD. First, I'd like to make the point that it is desirable and appropriate that generalized anxiety disorder is a diagnosable condition. It deserves that designation because GAD is not just the tendency to worry or be keyed up. We all have the tendency to worry from time to time, to be keyed up and feel tense. Indeed, those tendencies can be adaptive, can help us prepare for emerging difficulties. However, worry and tension can be excessive and therefore deserving of therapeutic attention. Research has shown that generalized anxiety disorder is a different animal altogether. The person with GAD would describe himself as a constant worrier, and those who knew him well would agree with that assessment. His worries are persistent. He feels stuck in his worried state. He would also describe himself as stuck in a state of physical tension. He might describe himself as uptight and tense all the time. He is constantly vigilant and apprehensive. As one GAD sufferer put it, "I feel like I'm always walking in a war zone." We are all familiar with the notion of a cliffhanger as it applies to a novel or a movie. The cliffhanger captures our attention. It creates tension in a good way for the story. However, the world for the person with generalized anxiety disorder, as reflected in their thoughts and worries, is like living from one cliffhanger to the next, but not in a good way. They are constantly besieged by thoughts such as, do I have enough money? Is there going to be a school shooting in my community? Do I need to develop more skills to keep my job? Might I be developing heart disease? Did I say something stupid at the party last night? Is the economy going to collapse? And on and on. The world for the GAD sufferer often shrinks down to this endless do loop of worries. Even if the person with generalized anxiety disorder, a part of them anyway, thinks their worry is unreasonable or excessive, they still can't turn the worry off. And that inability to turn the worry off is a central feature of GAD. A major diagnostic criteria for GAD is that significant worry occurs almost every day for at least 6 months. When does worry tip from being helpful to non-helpful? The following questions can help flush out the tipping point. For example, when I notice I am wrapped up in worry and want to focus on something else, am I able to switch the worry off? Are my worries extremely upsetting to me? Make it difficult to get things done? Do I worry so much that I am rarely able to relax? Do I notice that I worry about things that others worry about, but in a more exaggerated manner? Do I worry much of the time without ever reaching a possible solution for a particular problem? Do I believe that if I don't worry, a terrible event will be more likely to happen? If your answer to a number of these questions is yes, you might have generalized anxiety disorder and might want to examine the tendency to worry so much. Generalized anxiety disorder can be a torment for the person going through it. GAD certainly undermines peace of mind. It can get in the way of daily activities and responsibilities. It can get so intense that the person has difficulty functioning. Over time, it can contribute to physical health problems. Approximately 4% of the population struggles with generalized anxiety disorder. So, what is the particular nature of GAD, this different animal? Early on, when researchers were beginning to identify the particular details of GAD, they found it desirable to think of GAD as having three basic components: a thinking component, which basically involves worrying, a feeling component, which involves feelings of anxiety and apprehension, as well as those physical symptoms I mentioned earlier, and a behavior component. Behavior that goes along with GAD includes avoiding situations that the person worries about, or seeking reassurance about situations the worries about. Breaking generalized anxiety disorder down into component parts has a number of benefits. Many with GAD and those trying to help them find the condition to be diffuse, this pervasive tendency to worry and feel tense. But by pinpointing its specific components, we make the condition less mysterious and identify the particular components that then become targets for treatment and change. We have also learned that these three components have a dynamic relationship with one another. They reinforce one another in a kind of negative cycle. The more one worries, the more one feels tense, which then leads to avoidance behavior or reassurance-seeking behavior, which often evokes more worry, and so on. The flip side of this cycle is that when we can effect a positive change in one component, the thinking component, worrying, let's say, that tends to generate positive change in the feeling and behavioral components of GAD. So let's go through the three areas, starting with the thinking or worrying component. First, let's define worry. Worry is usually defined as focusing our thoughts on some kind of threat, that something undesirable is happening or could happen. Now, this can be helpful at times, but with GAD, the worry is excessive and counterproductive. To understand this tendency, we need to understand the particular quality of worry in those with GAD. When we zero in on those with excessive worry, what do we see? Research has enabled us to pinpoint two fundamental ways of thinking, which we characterize as distorted thinking, two ways in which those with GAD interpret life events. The first distortion involves overestimating the probability that something threatening or undesirable might happen. For example, a person with GAD hearing a report that the economy is not doing so well might jump to the conclusion that they are likely to lose their job. The second key distortion involves overestimating the severity of the undesirable thing happening, a tendency that has been labeled catastrophizing. For example, the person who worries about losing their job might view that possibility not just as something undesirable or quite stressful, but as having very damaging, ruinous, unrecoverable impacts on their life or family. They imagine the worst-case scenario. With chronic worriers, it is not so much what they worry about. They tend to worry about the same kinds of things as those that are not chronic worriers, such as health concerns, job or school performance, finances, trying to be a good friend or family member. It's not what they worry about, but how they worry. Specifically, with these two distortions, the overestimation of the probability and the overestimation of the severity of some undesirable event, the threshold for worry is very low. The person with GAD always feels on high alert. The danger is lurking. In addition, we have also identified 3 beliefs associated with chronic worry. These beliefs, kind of basic rules of the road, reflect the GAD sufferer's attempt to ward off threats, but these beliefs end up just reinforcing the worried state. The first belief is perfectionism, the belief that one cannot and should not make mistakes, and that to make mistakes in judgment, decision-making, parenting, work, or whatever represents incompetence in managing life. With this belief, there is the constant pressure to always make the right judgment or display the perfect behavior. The second belief relates to responsibility, that it is irresponsible not to focus on negative possibilities. Thus, worries that pop up in one's mind should not be ignored, and that worrying means you're being responsible, whereas not worrying is to be irresponsible. The third key belief that we have identified we label controllability, the belief that worry is a way of gaining control and preventing negative outcomes from coming true. This is reflected in a thought such as, I am glad I worried about my daughter because she made it safely home from her trip. These 3 beliefs maintain the worry and anxiety and help explain why chronic worriers have such difficulty switching off their worry and anxiety. Even though there is a part of them that wants to switch it off, there is also a part of them that feels that switching it off would be irresponsible and might even increase the possibility of some unwanted outcome. The good news is, our detailed understanding of these thinking errors and beliefs that lead to chronic worry have enabled us to design targeted treatment strategies to counteract and help those for whom worry has become to seem so intractable. The second component of GAD is the physical component, which refers to the physical sensations or symptoms, such as restlessness, difficulty relaxing, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, usually due to the mind racing, also feeling easily tired, headaches, gastrointestinal difficulties, and feeling irritable and on edge. These physical sensations are a result of our brains sending a message to our autonomic nervous system. The message sent is, there's some kind of threat and we need greater energy, the energy that goes along with our fight or flight system. We need that energy to deal with the threat. Now let me give just a brief description of how our nervous system works. The autonomic nervous system has 2 branches, called the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. The sympathetic branch revs up our energy to deal with the threat. The parasympathetic branch puts on the brakes to this energy arousal when it's no longer needed. The parasympathetic branch helps us to regain our emotional balance and restores our body to a normal resting state. However, the research on GAD suggests that there are low levels of parasympathetic control, which means that those with GAD don't put on the brakes as frequently or effectively as they should. The result is, our bodies get stuck in a state of higher arousal when they no longer need to be in a state of high arousal, kind of like they're stuck in third gear in situations in which they only need to be in second gear, which explains the classical physical symptoms of GAD, such as muscle tension, sleep difficulty, irritability, and difficulty relaxing. The third component of GAD is behavior. We want to highlight three kinds of behavior in relation to GAD. First, there is the behavior that is the direct result of anxiety, such as difficulty concentrating and restlessness. We want to target this behavior because it compromises one's ability to solve problems. Avoidance is another important behavioral component of GAD. When we feel threatened by something, we tend to avoid it. That's not always a bad thing, but if we are overestimating the threat, then avoiding it just reinforces the notion that the threat is serious. By avoiding, we miss the opportunity to see that perhaps the threat is not as bad as we predicted, or that we can cope with it, the threat, even if it is somewhat difficult. Another meaningful behavior involves what we call overcautiousness or reassurance-seeking behavior. Examples might include calling frequently to make sure your family members are safe, or being overprotective with your children. Such behavior may provide reassurance briefly, but ends up contributing to your chronic worry. Now that you have a more detailed understanding of the components of GAD, let's turn to the treatment approach. The cognitive behavioral treatment of GAD is a scientific approach in which you develop skills to think, behave, and react physically in new ways to overcome your chronic worry and anxiety. With CBT, you will learn how to alter the negative predictions which lead you to feel unsafe and out of control. Learn how to alter them by thinking more accurately about the real possibilities of something bad happening. You will learn how to think less catastrophically and to rehearse coping with real-life difficulties. In CBT, you will learn how to shift your body from its tense state, caused by a constant over-arousal of your nervous system, to a more relaxed state, thereby interrupting the vicious cycle of worry leading to physical tension, leading to more worry, and so on. You will learn how to change your reassurance-seeking behavior, so you learn that the dangers you predict either do not happen, or you realize you can cope with them. You will learn how to take on situations you may have avoided because of your negative predictions. And you will learn effective problem-solving strategies to deal with the legitimate, stressful events in your life. I will describe some of these skill sets in a few minutes, but first let me outline the first stage of treatment, which we call the self-awareness or self-monitoring stage. This is where we ask the client to monitor and record their anxiety and worry states, so they can learn the when, where, and under what circumstances they have anxiety. We also ask them to pinpoint and record the particular thoughts that make up their worried state, and the particular physical symptoms they are experiencing when anxious, and the behaviors triggered by their anxiety, including behaviors they display to try to get reassurance. This self-monitoring step has a number of benefits. Most critically, it identifies the particular thinking, feeling, and behavioral components of anxiety that we want to target for treatment. It also facilitates becoming more of an observer of one's anxiety and worry, rather than just being a victim of it. By pinpointing the conditions under which one gets anxious and the different components of the anxiety, this monitoring counteracts one of the core vulnerabilities of someone who has GAD, namely that they feel that their anxiety and worry is unpredictable and uncontrollable. Becoming more of an objective observer of their anxiety, rather than just being swept up in it, gives hope that this condition can perhaps be controlled. And by keeping a record of the frequency and intensity of the anxiety episodes, we have a record from which to measure progress once we start the treatment strategies. After a few sessions developing this self-monitoring skill, the component of GAD that we often turn our attention to first is the physical symptoms, the physical tension that is one of the hallmarks of chronic worry. This is an important target for change because the physical symptoms are painful, often the reason someone seeks out treatment, and because this state of chronic over-arousal of the nervous system leads to a greater susceptibility to worry. It would certainly be desirable to have a tool to reduce this physical tension. Well, there is such a tool called progressive muscle relaxation, where the person develops the skill to shift their body from a tense state to a noticeably more relaxed state. A tool to bolster the parasympathetic branch of their nervous system. Progressive muscle relaxation is much more than telling a person to relax. It is a key anxiety management skill which requires a good deal of practice. Another reason why we introduce it early in treatment. However, once learned, it can be quite helpful. Here's how it works. First, we ask you to focus on a particular muscle group in your body. By muscle group, we simply mean the muscles in a particular part of your body, such as the muscles in your shoulder area, muscles in your upper arms or lower arms, muscles surrounding your abdomen, and so on. We start with one muscle group, let's say the muscles in your shoulder area, and ask you to tense up those muscles, to scrunch up your shoulders and make them tense and tight, and then to hold that tension for about 10 seconds. In this step, you try to create as much tension as you can and to focus on that tension. Then we give a signal, usually saying the word relax, whereby we ask you to let go of the tension. Just let the muscles go limp and relax. We ask you to keep your focus on that same muscle group and notice the contrast between the tension when your muscles were scrunched up and the release of tension, the relaxation. We ask you to keep that focus on the relaxation for about 20 seconds, during which time we ask you to say a word to yourselves, typically the word relax, every time you exhale. Now, what's behind this technique? How is it effective? By creating tension and then releasing it, we've learned that this facilitates the relaxation response. It gives the relaxation response some momentum, kind of like a pendulum that's set up high and therefore swings higher to the other side. The relaxation response is stronger after the release of tension. By focusing attention on the muscle groups, you learn that tension doesn't have to be your default state, but something you can begin to exert some control over. Also, by focusing on the body in the here and now, you are weakening the association between tension and worry. If you do notice worries popping up during the exercise, we encourage you to do a mindfulness exercise, such as picturing the worries as clouds passing by in the sky or as background noise outside your apartment that you don't have to pay attention to. When we first teach progressive muscle relaxation in the office, we move from one muscle group to the next. Initially, we go through 16 different muscle groups in the body. We then ask the client to practice this progressive muscle relaxation exercise at home without distractions. Now, this is time-consuming. Initially, it can take about 30 minutes to go through all the muscle groups. However, we emphasize that it is a skill, and like any skill, requires time and practice. This is the training phase of progressive muscle relaxation. We then move to the application phase, which initially involves reducing the number of muscle groups from 16 to 8. We don't eliminate any muscle groups, we just combine them so the client tenses and relaxes more muscle groups together, covering a larger portion of the body. By reducing the number of muscle groups to 8, we shorten the procedure. The client then practices this until he develops some mastery with it. Then we shift the number of muscle groups to 4, then 2, and finally a one-step entire muscle relaxation shift. We ask the client to practice this one-step procedure with distractions. Thus, they are then able to carry this skill of shifting from tension to relaxation into real-life situations. Progressive muscle relaxation is not a magical cure-all for all the components of GAD, but it is a concrete tool that provides relief, breaks up the vicious cycle of tension leading to worry, and gives the client hope that they can have control over what had been seen as an uncontrollable condition. Now let's turn our attention to the thinking component, the intense worry we described earlier. Again, here we're not talking about constructive worry, which can help us prepare for a problem, but worry that is excessive, worry we can't turn off. Fortunately, there are many techniques we can bring to bear to disrupt this tendency to worry. A colleague, Robert Leahy, in an excellent self-help book called The Worry Cure, has outlined many of these strategies. Most of them are cognitive techniques aimed to identify, question, and dispute the thoughts that make up the worry. Remember, research has identified that 2 of the frequent characteristics of worry with GAD sufferers are the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of a negative event and the tendency to imagine the worst-case scenario of a negative event. So how does this disputing work, particularly to challenge these 2 key distortions in GAD? The first step is to identify the specifics that make up the worry. People with GAD typically feel lost in a sea of worry, unable to view their anxiety and worry objectively. However, in that self-monitoring phase of treatment, clients realize that their worries are really a list of specific thoughts, almost always predictions about something bad that might happen in the future. By identifying the worries as specific predictions, the client begins to feel not so overwhelmed by their worries and feel that they are in a better position to question those predictions. The next step is to do just that, to evaluate the real odds of something undesirable happening. We pose questions such as, what do you think the real odds are of the negative prediction coming true? How often have you worried about a particular negative outcome, for example, getting fired, or that a loved one will get in an automobile accident? How many times have you worried about those things, and how many times have they actually come true? Are there facts or data you could seek out that might help you make a more accurate prediction, such as the statistics of the likelihood of someone getting into a serious automobile accident? Thus, the client learns how to pose questions that help determine the real odds, the real likelihood of some negative event happening. Questions that lead to answers that have integrity, meaning they are based on evidence. The next step that flows from this questioning is to put into words or pictures the more realistic scenario. To picture your spouse arriving home safely in the car, or perhaps picture a conversation with your supervisor where the supervisor might not be totally happy with your work, but the conversation doesn't result in you getting fired. Now, how do we deal with the second distortion in unproductive worry, the tendency to imagine the worst-case scenario? For example, imagining that you're going to be fired after turning in a less than perfect report. Imagine that you're going into bankruptcy after incurring a little bit of debt. Well, first, we always want to question the likelihood of these particular negative predictions. But then we go ahead and encourage the person to picture their worst-case scenario and ask them to rate the severity of it. In the midst of worry, they almost always consider the event as awful, god-awful, catastrophic, something they just couldn't bear. But if asked to actually rate it, we usually suggest a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 represents the most awful thing they could imagine. They often recognize that the event they are worried about is not the most awful event. The event is undesirable, perhaps very undesirable, but there's a recognition that it is perhaps not absolutely god-awful. The next question is to ask them to picture the undesirable event and then imagine how they might cope with it, how life might go on even if the undesirable event happens. Most people with GAD don't take this step, and therefore, in their minds, they're always stuck in this kind of cliffhanger image, the bad thing happening or about to happen, but not what could happen next. By picturing how they might cope, they realize they are not stuck in the cliffhanger image and that there might be things they could do to deal with the unfortunate event. Decatastrophizing is going from the thought, oh my God, what if such and such happens, to the thought, even if something unfortunate happens, I can imagine coping with it and that it's not absolutely insufferable. Now let's turn to the behavioral component of GAD. One of the key behavioral components of GAD that we want to target for change is what we call reassurance or safety-seeking behavior. This is behavior designed to try to reduce the possibility of some negative outcome or to try to reduce the worry about that outcome. Examples might be constantly checking in with your family to make sure they are safe, or always staying late at work to minimize the chance you won't get your work done on time. This behavior may provide someone with reassurance briefly, but when relied upon, ends up reinforcing the worry because the person doesn't give himself a chance to see that the negative thing they are worried about doesn't happen, or if it does, can be managed. Instead of challenging the thinking involved in their worry, they engage in behavior that gives in to the excessive worry. Thus, we try to reduce this reassurance-seeking, anxiety-driven behavior and replace it with non-anxious behavior, such as calling your family less frequently about their safety, not feeling compelled to stay at work late every night to always get your work done on time. The goal here is to build up the behavior that goes along with tolerating imperfection, letting go of attempts to control everything, letting go of the sense of responsibility for unlikely events, and recognizing that making mistakes is part of being human. When someone pushes back against their reassurance-seeking behavior, that can cause an increase in anxiety in the short run. Therefore, we usually focus on behavior change after the person has learned the coping skills of relaxation and thinking more realistically. They can then bring these skills to bear on building up new behavior that undermines their general tendency to worry and be tense and constantly seek reassurance. Likewise, if someone with GAD has been avoiding legitimate problems such as seeing a doctor when appropriate or developing a realistic budget, we encourage taking on these situations. especially since they now have new coping skills. Pushing back on the tendencies to seek reassurance and the tendency to avoid situations that need to be tackled will help cement the tendency to worry less and help solve problems more effectively. This is the ultimate goal of treatment. I hope this has given you a thumbnail sketch of how CBT can help those with generalized anxiety disorder by addressing the components of worry, physical tension, and self-defeating behavior with specific techniques. I describe some of the techniques, but there are many other techniques that can be helpful. If you want to learn about these techniques or about the treatment of other anxiety difficulties, please don't hesitate to visit our website. I want to conclude by emphasizing that GAD is a condition worthy of treatment, and fortunately, there is a research-tested, effective treatment program to help those who suffer from chronic worry. Thank you.